Hello and welcome to your practice. Today we'll be going over Janu Shirshasana, which is a seated forward fold with one leg outstretched. It means head to knee posture. And we'll also do a variation with both legs outstretched, your traditional seated forward fold. So to begin, it's really important to feel mobile and flexible and free and easy in your movement at the pelvis. So we'll do a few different variations of pelvic tilts. We'll start with some seated pelvic tilts. Just bringing your hands to cup right around that bowl or bucket of your pelvis, and then feel it spill backward, center, and forward. Backward, through the center, and forward. And just keep going with those. It's not so much a seated cat-cow as a real focused pelvic movement. When you tilt your pelvis forward and spill the bucket forward, that's called an anterior pelvic tilt. And when you tilt it backward, that's called a posterior pelvic tilt. So we tilt forward and back. We'll do one more of each. And then just find neutral. Come back to the center. Now we'll try to do these from a tabletop position. Again, we're not going into a full cat-cow, but rather just tilting the pelvis forward and back. Just making sure you feel familiar with each of those positions. And can control the movement. Feel what it feels like to come to the center. And then we'll come around. Let's try a few pelvic tilts from our backs. Coming down. Just notice what position your pelvis is in normally. If you look down and it's neutral, flat, you could balance a cup of tea right on your pelvis, then you're in a neutral position. If you feel like your low back pops up and your pelvis tips away, then you tend to hang out in that forward pelvic tilt, an anterior pelvic tilt. If your low back presses down and you look and it would be tea spilling onto your belly, then you tend to hang out in a posterior pelvic tilt. So now we'll purposefully tilt the pelvis forward and backward, forward and backward. Another way to think about this is to imagine that you're imprinting the spine, pressing the lower spine into your mat as your pelvis tilts back, and then releasing as your pelvis tilts forward. And you can even check to see if this is happening by putting your hands underneath your back and smushing your fingers with your lower back as you imprint the spine, and then freeing up the fingers as you release and tilt the pelvis forward. So just try one more. And then come back to a neutral pelvis. We'll roll over onto one side and press all the way up. Now we'll come into a seated staff position. And now it's probably going to get a bit more challenging. So notice what position you end up in here. For many of us, there's a tendency, because of tight hamstrings or maybe some weakness in the core muscles or the hip flexors, to spill backwards with that bucket. And if that's you, then it might be a good idea to fold a blanket and put it right underneath your sitting bones, or roll up your mat for a little extra elevation. Feel free to soften or bend your knees a little, and then see if you can tilt the pelvis back and forward, even if it's ever so slightly from this position. We'll do a few more. And the reason this is important is because when we're going into a seated forward fold, we want to make sure that we're not starting from a posterior pelvic tilt or a backward spilling pelvis. If you do that, what will happen is the pelvis is tipped back, And so to compensate, we tend to round our mid backs and even our upper backs, and then we can't get very far at all in our fold. And we usually think that the problem has something to do with tightness in the backs of the legs, which it might, but it probably also has to do with the positioning and the mobility of the pelvis. So we want to start in a neutral pelvis and then even tilt the pelvis forward slightly. So from your seated staff posture, prop yourself up as much as you need to get a very slight forward pelvic tilt. Don't even worry about reaching or trying to touch your shins or your toes. Just let your hands rest on the floor beside you. So it's just a seated staff pose, but with a very slight forward angle. And take about 3 breaths right here. When you're ready, return to your neutral pelvis, back to a seated position. Now those preparatory steps should have gotten us pretty well ready to come into head to knee posture. So pick one leg and draw it in, bringing your foot right up against the inner thigh, and then see if you can start to tilt your pelvis forward again, bringing your hands just slightly out in front of your shoulders. So even though the name of the posture suggests that your head should be somewhere near your knee, it's likely not going to go there. And this position right here totally counts as Janu Shirshasana, head to knee posture. If you're feeling good here and you feel like you need a little more sensation, just try walking your hands forward another inch or two and letting your pelvis tilt forward even more. When that happens, your torso will naturally tip down a little closer to your leg. Keep taking nice, slow, steady breaths. Sometimes it helps to really lengthen and release on each exhalation. You might find that when you've been in the posture for a little bit of time, your body wants to travel a little further. Just make sure you're not forcing or straining that to happen. If your forearms are getting close to the ground, you can rest on the outer arms and gently hold your leg, or some people might be able to hold the bottom of their foot. When you've had enough, bring your hands under your shoulders for support and slowly hinge up, taking your time to arrive back at your neutral pelvis and your upright seated position. Take a moment to notice what you feel, and then change sides when you're ready. I didn't mention it before, but you can feel free to add support underneath the outer thigh of your bent knee, or your bent leg, if you feel like you need a little extra support there. So just like before, we'll start with a long seated spine and a neutral pelvis, and then imagine spilling that bucket forward, taking a little anterior pelvic tilt, and just bring your hands slightly out in front of your shoulders. And stay right here for at least 3 breaths, maybe even the whole time. If you feel like you're wanting to travel forward, just listen to your body. Go slow so that you have time to receive any feedback. And then when you've had enough, bring your hands right under your shoulders and lift up. So now that we've done both legs separately, we'll take both legs back out together. We'll find ourselves here in a seated staff posture, taking a nice full breath. And then once again, we'll tilt the pelvis forward, just bringing the hands slightly in front of the shoulders. This might be your seated forward bend for the whole time, but stay for at least 3 breaths to acclimate and check in. If in time you feel ready to deepen a little bit, you can just walk your hands forward, taking frequent pauses to notice how you feel. And when you feel like you've had enough, bring your hands underneath your shoulders and press up, supporting your torso as you lift back to a seated staff. And then bend your knees to come into a comfortable seated position. So that concludes our breakdown of head to knee posture and a seated forward fold. Feel free to continue your practice or thank your body and mind for showing up. And I thank you for practicing with me today. Namaste.